Hi, everyone. You're listening to Creative Frequency. It is the first podcast and first episode that I will be hosting, and I'm very excited to introduce my guests, or even, I guess, my guest will also introduce himself. But before we get into the topic of today's episode, I simply want to say that Creative Frequency is a podcast about art and sound and how we can explore the world of art and sound with those who shape it. So, welcome, Teddy. I don't even ask, do you want me to call you by your first name? Well, I've already spoiled it, but yeah, welcome, Teddy. Thank you so much for your time. I'm very excited to have you, especially as the first guest. How are you feeling? How's life treating you?
I'm feeling fine, thank you. It's a very busy period for us. Um, I'm the director of learning and engagement at the Philharmonia Orchestra, and it's a real pleasure to get to come back and do a bit more work with you and get to speak with you again, given our kind of extensive collaborations, which I'm sure you'll
Yeah.
speak about in a moment. But it's nice. It's nice to be busy.
It's nice to see you again because it's been a couple of months. I feel like, well, has it been months? Yes. So I think this is also our catch up in a way. For people who do not know much about you, could you share a little bit about your journey, including your, from a classical training perspective, as well as how you got into your current role at the Philharmonia Orchestra?
Sure. So I started out. As a music student at university, classically trained, I recognized pretty early on that I was never going to make a career as a performer, but I was
Mm.
passionately engaged with music. I was into composing and conducting, um, and really to a huge extent musicology. I wanted to know about the history of music, how music fits together, the
Mm.
context of music, and all those sorts of things.
Mm.
And that led me into a teaching career. So I then spent the better part of 15 years teaching, from sort of Key Stage 3 all the way up to university, um, uh, teaching in performance and composition and music theory and those sorts of things, but also in the history of music and musicology. Um, I was a head of music in a number of different London schools. Then I had a very big career break where I went and did something very very different.
Oh, really?
I went and I went to work for two major human rights charities.
Really? I didn't know
Uh,
that.
so I went to work. I went to work for
Nice.
MenCap first, and then Humanist UK second.
Okay.
And having spent a number of years in human rights, there was a bit of a call back to uh, wanting to re-engage with music. And given that
Mm.
the overwhelming majority of my career has been focused on education and learning and the sort of the drive for kind of making the world a better place through that,
Yeah.
it led me to my current job. So, head of director of learning engagement at the Philharmonia Orchestra,
Mm.
resident at the South Bank Centre, as well as several residencies across the UK.
That's very interesting, especially from that human rights perspective. Was that always something that also draw you into that music side when it comes to, I guess, training and your education and your interest in music? And then we will dive into classical music specifically. But was that something that you was looking for as well in terms of like, human rights and the political discourse, using music as a way to do that?
For sure.
Okay.
In fact, I think it's probably fair to say that um, the most of the most popular music, the music that is listened to most, tends to be music that has something to say to its audience.
Yeah.
It connects with them on a fundamental level.
Mm.
And I certainly remember from my childhood the pieces of music that echoed most with me were the ones that spoke to my slight sort of activist side. I think it's important to recognize that the purpose of music is to communicate the human condition. And when the human condition is faced with oppression, when it is faced with inequity, when it is used to hold a mirror to society's failings, it can be an incredibly powerful artistic tool to challenge, to raise awareness of issues that will be commonplace to people, and that was absolutely my experience musically, both as a child, and then later as a student, and then partly through the world of education in general. Part of that purpose is, what is the music trying to say? What is it trying to communicate? And if the music isn't trying to communicate anything at all, it's very difficult for audiences to understand a way in to connect to it, whatever that might be. For me, I think you're absolutely right. The idea of civil rights as being a kind of central message of music is extremely powerful one, and one that lives and breathes in arts organizations today.
How did that shape your I guess when it comes to music education and being at the Philharmonia Orchestra, how has that background or that influence shaped how you approach any projects or workshops or anything that is, I guess, you oversee what's happening? How does that come together? How has that shaped how you provide education?
I think so. The current season that we've been producing and programming at the Philharmonia is a concert series called "Let Freedom Ring," celebrating the sounds of America. Of course, a very particular discourse of a country of great diversity, a huge plurality of voices, and of musical expression. So the various genres and forms of music that have emerged from America in the last 150, 200 years is immense. And we've put on a program of classical music that kind of merges and fuses with jazz, and really try and explore what that means. And for a lot of it, there is a lot of understanding that the placement of civil rights is critical to understanding the movement of the music. And whether that's the kind of civil rights that people like Copeland was thinking of when he was writing Fanfare for the Common Man, or whether that was the kind of sense of trying to unpick the stories of the American people, like Dvorak's New World Symphony, that incorporates Native American melodies and Afro-American spirituals, and a drawing in of that. Or whether looking more explicitly at the kind of the very obvious civil rights inspired pieces, written by early African American composers, like Florence Price and Duke Ellington, and composers of that nature, that were pretty explicit in what they were trying to achieve. And then, of course, moving forward into music that the Philharmonia doesn't necessarily do, but the kind of the civil rights 1960s songs that were very clearly protest songs, I think really kind of pulls out. I think all of that sort of programming intent then comes out in the various education projects. So whether that's sort of pre-concert insights, in conversations with soloists or conductors or composers, to just try and explore the music a little bit. But also the education projects that we do within schools, and saying, hey, here's great music, and look at the diversity of composers, look at the diversity of performers and conductors who are doing it. let's bring you to a concert.
Yeah.
So let's get some of the school kids to come along and watch some of the music being performed and make it relevant in their classroom, because it should connect with history and geography
Yeah.
and so many subjects
Yeah.
across the curriculum. Music, I don't think, should just be a
That
single
single thing.
yeah,
Yes,
it
exactly.
should connect more widely. And
Yeah.
if we can bring a little bit of that into schools, then I think we're doing a good job.
Yeah, I think that's a great approach, especially when it comes to learning. I feel like our brains are very, I guess, susceptible to different ways of absorbing information, and especially when it comes to music, which is something that's very fluid. I think there's so much room to adapt and, I guess, pique people's interests and see where they want to learn and engage in history and etc. I guess my segue is going into more the classical, I guess, classical dialogue. What is your definition of classical music, and how does the orchestra or Philharmonia Orchestra engage? I guess you've already mentioned this a little bit about, like, being very active and trying to engage people through the talks, the concerts, but also being in schools. But what is your definition when it comes to classical music? Because I've read so many definitions, and it's like, yeah.
So I really struggle with this. I think there's on a very practical level, I think the phrase classical music is an incredibly wide ranging term that is used by people as a shorthand for something that they've got in their head, rather than necessarily meaning the same thing to everybody.
Yeah.
Strictly speaking, of course, classical music is from the classical period, so a period from about 1750 to about 1820 of Western European tradition.
Yeah.
But that's not the definition that most people are going to use. It is much more likely to be a sort of all-encompassing kind of art music of Western culture that spans from the early Renaissance through to, and then I think this is important, through to literally now. Classical music is being written right now. But for me, I think one of the interesting parts of the definition of classical music is where are the edges? And we mentioned jazz a moment ago. So
Yeah.
is Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue a piece of classical music, or is it a piece of jazz, or does it bridge somewhere between the two, and what does that look like?
Yeah.
What about some of the sitar concertos written by Ravi Shankar and others? Is that Indian classical? Is that Western classical? Is that a true hybrid and a fusion? And if so, does that have a special name to it? Or do we just treat all music that is kind of high art as opposed to popular? I struggle with that term, because look at the popularity of things like Classic FM. Look at the popularity of classical music in its use in film and game music.
Yeah.
Look at it. Look at how often orchestral concerts sell out because there's a particular piece that people recognise from whatever that might be. A TV theme it may have been used for, or an advert, or all of those sorts of things are also all classical, and to say that they're therefore not popular, I think, would be a misnomer. Now, I'm recognizing that I'm not actually answering the question with what is the definition, and I think it's because I genuinely struggle with the idea that there is a neat box that it fits into. I think it fills quite a few boxes. I think it stands in its own right against other genres. So it is not house music. It is not jazz. It is not various other things. But I think it will often touch a lot of those things. And I think the other thing that I think is quite important as a distinction is, while an orchestra will play the majority of its concert repertoire as classical music,
Yeah.
it is by far the only thing that orchestras will do. And I've already mentioned that film music and game music, but there's lots of pop music, music from the musicals, and lots of other concerts the force of an orchestra, 85 people all playing together, really lifts and adds. You've only got to look at the popularity of concerts of pop bands that stand at the front of a full orchestra, to kind of recognise that the force of an orchestra is so much more than just a small elitist group of string players playing Mozart.
Yeah.
Although that is also important because it also has a place in the history of music, and people want to listen to Mozart in its own right as well.
Yes. I think that's funny that you mentioned elitism, but I think maybe like I'll pause it for just a few minutes, because when you mentioned about people engaging more with classical music, whether this is through a concert or through film or gaming, obviously the audiences are very diverse. How do you really engage diverse audiences and communities when it comes to appreciating classical music in its like core form, and not always in relation to a movie or a game or something else?
Absolutely. I think the starting point is always access,
Okay.
and what is it that the audience is wanting from an experience. So there are a couple of questions there. So the first one is around, are we making sure that our spaces, our programming, the appeal of it, the concert itself, in our case, is accessible, is something that audiences feel that they can walk into that space and feel that it is for them.
Yeah.
And so we, along with all of the UK orchestras and the various kind of arts organisations and bodies, work constantly and tirelessly to try and remove as many barriers to access as is possible, whether that's initiatives like a student pulse ticket offer so that you get incredibly cheap tickets, whether that's free tickets for first timers through sort of projects and programs that certainly we at the Philharmonia do, whether that's holding events specifically to unpack some of the mysteries, to try and demystify the experience and the program, just to break down some of those barriers in the first place.
Yeah.
But the second part of that is, of course, about representation.
Yes.
We're very keen to make sure that when audiences walk into the space and see us on the stage, that they can recognize themselves somewhere within the program. So there are a number of things that we like to make sure are very evident. We, for example, try and make sure that we program a high number of women conductors on the podium, so that when people come and watch our concerts, it's not always a man who stands up and waves a baton. Our guest principal conductor is Marion Alsop, the first woman to conduct the last night of the proms. We're extremely lucky to have her. Our artist in residence this year is Shomik Datta, world-renowned Indian classical sarod player.
Amazing.
Last year it was Love Sega. Our one of our featured artists this year, who sang as part of our New World concert last night, was Julia Bullock. Amazing classical singer. And having that sort of diversity of people actually on the stage
yes,
is a really important part of how we make sure that audiences kind of can look across
Yeah.
and think this is something that I am able to connect to.
Yeah.
It's also about programming. We want to make sure that we're programming a diverse number of composers,
Yeah.
both historic and contemporary.
Mm.
We have a Music of Today series that programs music of contemporary living composers, and the music that is being written literally now for ensembles, and a program that we run called Composers Academy that takes 3 emerging composers from underrepresented groups that otherwise perhaps struggle to have their music heard in mainstream programming.
Yeah.
We think it's absolutely critical that all of those things play a part in trying and making sure
Yeah.
that not just classical music, but the arts generally are accessible to as many audience members as possible. Of course, there is a slight side to that as well, where if people just don't like it, we're not going to force them to come along to
that's true.
concerts.
I feel like it also, touching on the first 2 points, I feel like there needs to be interest already for them to then go and seek and then know, like, oh, this is accessible to me. Oh, I can go to all of these different activities. Oh, there is space for me. Oh, I do see myself represented on these stages. But when there is this perception of, oh, classical music is very white, it's put as elitist, because that was my my perspective on it. Like, well, yeah, that's not really for me. Like, I every time, because I didn't even know about the African American spirituals, and I started to learn more about it as I was working on my project. But obviously, there's a lot of things that the Philharmonia Orchestra is doing in order to make it accessible. And I'm sure that there are other organizations and initiatives that are doing the same. So I feel like it comes down to changing the I guess the public discourse, or the perception of why is there a stigma, if we can call it a stigma, surrounding this topic or surrounding this genre of music. Yeah, I guess I wanted to just, say that as well, because I'm like, that we can do so much. Or institutions can do so much. But if I am a young girl, a 15-year-old Black girl in Peckham, for me, there's no really like interest for me to, I'm going to go and seek, unless it gets introduced into, the educational system, and you are there suddenly in the classroom talking about it. And then how does that pique my interest as a young Black girl? The minute that there is interest, then yes, all these gates open. Like, oh, there is a way for me to enter these spaces, and I'm very welcomed.
That's absolutely right. And I think there is a big question to be had over what is actually being taught in schools.
Yeah.
I think there is or
how it is portrayed, how classical music is like absorbed, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a bit of a saying that, kind of systemic issues require systemic solutions. And so anything that, like the perception of classical music being elitist, if that is a systemic thing, that the majority of people in the country think that classical music is elitist, then that misconception, because I don't think it is elitist, needs to be challenged by every organisation that is able to challenge that. And I think that includes schools. And there are many schools up and down the country that are doing a great job of that. But again, I think it is about making sure that they are teaching. Teachers, of course, are put in an incredible position of pressure to be able to get through the curriculum in the first place. With music, it has traditionally been very easy. I think back to my early teaching career, it was very easy to say, well, we'll just teach them about Mozart and Beethoven and Bach and, a few key composers who are all white dead men.
Yeah.
And that's probably not the best way
Yeah.
to,
Well, that
to
was
be
my
engaging.
introduction.
Yeah,
Yeah.
probably not the best way to be engaging kids in Islington who are like, why do we care? Why do we care about this?
Yeah.
The opportunities to kind of say, well, okay, let's talk about classical music from the perspective of uh, from a real diversity of people who are engaged in classical music now.
Yeah.
Composers who have been woefully overlooked during music education over decades. I mean, I remember when I first started teaching, going to a school and looking at through the resources, and every single composer was a man. Like there were no women that were anywhere on the curriculum, and the idea of that now I think is I think would be very unlikely.
Okay.
I certainly hope it's very unlikely.
Yeah.
Um, given the huge contribution of women composers to classical music, there is such a plethora of voices to draw from, and the same is true, obviously, across ethnicity,
Yeah.
and disability.
Yeah.
The idea that you're just going to go to white dead men
Yeah.
should not be a thing anymore.
I mean, it has been changing, as you said. People are doing a lot more work to change this perspective, I guess. But you see this cross, like fusion in a way of different genres, where you have pop artists using or incorporating classical music, or even, I guess, this fusion of hip hop and classical music, or drum and bass and classical music. So I think that there's so much out there now that I'm now also exposed to, since I've been actively looking at, okay, so how does classical music come together with these other cultures, but also other genres. And I think this is a great way to get into Blue Voodoo, the project that I worked on, but obviously you were my mentor, which I am still very, very grateful for, because I learned so much, even though you didn't feel like you were contributing as much, but you did. So yeah, I guess I also wanted to ask you throughout this journey, from your perspective, what your experience was, I guess, because for those who are listening and watching, Blue Voodoo is a project about exploring Black African identity and using African ancestral traditional sounds, or even you could say ritual sounds, in combination with classical music. Listening and hearing the background story of like what Blue Voodoo is. What was your stance on that, or is?
So it was fascinating to watch the art grow and develop into the phenomenal product that you then created. And I think the bit that I was particularly struck by was the sense that you had of wanting to engage in genuine exploration, and absolute curiosity, and I think that was it really opened my eyes as well, because it made me very curious about all the things that I
Nice.
didn't know and I wanted to pull out. I think one of the things that struck me really quite early on, as you started the journey, and you were talking very thematically.
Yeah.
We want to talk about war, and we want to talk about loss, and sort of very, very big topics, very, very big themes. And it was interesting that from that starting point, there was a lot of opportunity to explore universal concepts, and how it might have been drawn from, and how that might have been used as inspiration for particular pieces of music from various different traditions and forms,
Yeah.
including classical. And I think it was just I was really struck by how you would often say, that's really interesting, but why does that say that, why is that saying that, that's a really interesting sound, but what's it trying to get across?
Yeah.
And I think that was really, really interesting, because there was a little bit of certainly of me, where some of my assumptions around, well, of course this means whatever this means,
Yeah.
was self-evident, and suddenly it was like, oh, actually no, I don't know if that is true. Maybe we do need to reassess, you know, what this particular composer was trying to say
Yeah.
with this piece. And your fusing together of particular sounds, I thought was really, really interesting. And I know that your piece quotes little snippets of melodic
Yes.
material in various ways, which I think is very, very clever. And I always like seeing that as a compositional tool of referencing other works and trying therefore to convey at least the sense of multiple meanings within.
Yes.
And I loved that whole approach. I thought that was a really, really lovely way of bringing together form, style, genre,
Mm-hmm.
into something that was then coherent.
Yeah.
And I think was my impression. I don't know if I had
I'm
so
really
much of a
happy.
stance on it, because I think the other thing that I certainly felt was that we were both very open to the idea that it was flexible,
Yeah.
that it was about exploration, and
Mm-hmm.
so where it ended up, the direction that it might take. I think I certainly feel like there wasn't a stance. Certainly that I was coming with.
Yeah.
I was just fascinated to see where it was going to go.
Yeah. What was your first impression after listening to the entire project? If you remember that feeling or thought.
That's I remember it. I remember thinking that it was. I remember thinking it was so much more coherent
Hmm.
than I think I thought it was going to be.
Yeah.
I think some of the conversations that we'd had, where you had said that you were going to be referencing music and pieces, I sort of had a sense that they would be much more obvious quotes.
Hmm.
The piece would, I don't know, sort of not quite stop, play a piece of Brahms or something,
Yeah.
and then come back in again.
Yeah.
I don't think it was going to be quite like that, but I thought that the quotes would be much more explicit, rather than woven in.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that was probably my first impression was, oh, this is a this piece of work it is really coherent in its own right.
Yeah.
And it is enhanced by the quotes. It is enhanced by the obvious influences from the various pieces of music specifically, but also the genres that you'd pulled it in from. But they don't dominate. It was, at no point was it cliched. At no point was it, it was just artistically authentic.
Yeah.
And I think that's what really struck me at the first bit, how successfully that had happened.
That's amazing. That's a great compliment. Thank you so much. I feel like throughout our journey as well, and researching all the different composers that used their music as a way to resist, because simply vocalizing wasn't possible, or simply using, just like being physically resistant to whatever it is that they were opposing to wasn't possible. They used artistic expression, they used music, they used their composition to communicate that to the masses, or to communicate that for themselves, that they are not driving, that they're not driving crazy. I got so much, just based on the conversations that we had, and even some of the suggestions that you made me look into the history of these composers as well. I think one of them was Sostakovich. I'm not sure if I'm even pronouncing it right. I always have trouble pronouncing his name. But I think reading into his history and his experiences, and using music as a way to resist, was something that really moved me. And I wanted that to be present, because essentially the project, or this body of work, is a form of like political and socio-economic resistance, and a tool to communicate that, whether this is using just some of these references to reference these composers or pieces, or using the classical instruments to signify or to make it like make a symbol out of, well, this is the opposing party, and I want the traditional African sounds to be combative as well. Obviously it's very layered, but I think having that revelation and learning more about these different people that I didn't even know existed at the time or knew very little about was also the driving force in trying to create something that was so interwoven within the project, because it made it more, I guess, immersive in a sense. But obviously when you create something, when it's out there in the ether, it can be interpreted in several ways and you don't have control over that. But my question to you then is there someone that comes to mind when it comes to, oh, they use their work as a way to resist, and I really admire how they did that, and that really struck me?
Well, you've probably already named the composer that would be my most obvious
Okay.
go-to, which is Shostakovich, who, for those who are less familiar perhaps,
Yeah.
was writing for most of his life in the USSR, and was writing a huge amount of his work specifically under the tyranny of Stalin. And he uses his music to try and express dissidence, often in a way that tried to communicate the human expression, whilst being mindful that he was living under a regime where he could have had a knock on the door and would have disappeared.
Yeah.
And I think that is a profound experience for any composer to be writing under such conditions. I think when it comes to dissidence, I think there's also an element of how how an individual composer's identity might influence how they try and express their in their music something that they're trying to say about themselves that they perhaps can't. So there are plenty of composers, for example, who were gay but couldn't be open about it, couldn't express it. I mean, there are some pretty obvious ones, like Benjamin Britten and Tchaikovsky and others, where there is a degree of speculation. Well, there is an awful lot that has been written about, particularly about composers like Benjamin Britten, about how that identity for them really played out. And I think that there are some really interesting parallels in gender as well. So I mentioned Copland's Fanfare for the Common Man, but there's also a series called Fanfare for the Uncommon Woman.
Oh, really?
Which I think is definitely worth exploring. 6 fanfares have so far been composed by the composer Joan Tower. And it's definitely worth, so that idea of trying to think through how one's identity really stands the composer in a sense of expression. I don't know how well I articulated that answer.
Yeah. I mean, I didn't know about the uncommon woman. That's very interesting. I think I will definitely, when I get home, do some more research and start listening. Again, it goes back to the diversity conversation and making sure that people are aware of these like variety of musicians, composers, and really get to explore their work, because it is really a shame that such great works are made and people are not being exposed to them. I guess unless you're actively searching and looking for these for these composers and compositions. But yeah, another topic that I thought would be interesting, especially from a humanist perspective, for those who are not so familiar with humanism. When I started looking into classical music and learning about classical music, prior to that, my assumption was classical music is just synonymous to religious music. And when I say religious music, I think that Christianity. But yeah, how interconnected is classical music with religion? And then what is your experience of that? Because obviously you are a humanist. I guess maybe even sharing a little bit about that and how that has, how do you experience classical music in that sense? Is it different? Is it not different? Does it seep in when it comes to any of the work that you do? I think that would be a very interesting thing to dissect in a way.
Sure. And I mean, it's really an obvious starting point that you're absolutely right. Christianity and the biggest umbrella of sort of classical music,
Yeah.
certainly historically have been interwoven. The early 15th century, 16th century music would have been divided more or less. Obviously, this is gross simplification, but into sacred and secular music. Sacred being for the church, and secular being folk music and sort of popular music and that sort of stuff.
Okay.
And there was a need for a very long time for the words of masses, of prayers, and of other liturgy for the church to be set to music. For one, setting words to music makes the words easier to remember. There have been various scientific studies, none of which I can cite off the top of my head, but that suggest that your recall of words is better when it is sung. Than spoken. And that goes back to sort of Gregorian chant and all of that sort of stuff, which we explored very early in our endeavours together. So it is certainly true that the church and classical music have had a very long shared history, but and this is why I do have a bit of a problem with the kind of the idea that classical music is inherently elitist, because the sacred bit of that, when we think about opera was popular entertainment. It was dramas set to music that people could go and watch. So the operas of Mozart were for popular entertainment. They were not linked to the church. A number of the sort of symphonies and bigger pieces of orchestral work may have been inspired by influences of the church, but they wouldn't necessarily have been they wouldn't have been settings of religious texts and things like that. There are plenty that are. Requiems are the most obvious. So the Mozart Requiem is a very famous piece. The Verdi Requiem, of course, Verdi.
Love that one.
Verdi was an atheist, and he when he wrote his Requiem with a very famous Desiree section, which is incredibly dramatic. It is basically an opera. It's a very operatic, very dramatic version of the Requiem. And it was suggested at the time, and has been suggested since, that it probably shouldn't be performed in churches because it isn't very decent form of expression of that religion. I think just to touch on the sort of my experience of it, as someone who's non-religious, who is a humanist. I think I can enjoy a piece of music for the sake of the piece of music. I can enjoy its harmonies and melodies, and I can enjoy the basis of what it is trying to say without needing to believe in the things that it is trying to convey. So for clarity, humanists look to science, evidence, and reason to understand the world around us in a naturalistic world, but look to empathy, compassion, and regard for others to bring morals, ethics, and meaning into our lives. So I don't believe in the supernatural. I don't believe in things like heaven and hell and those sorts of things. But I do believe in the human experience, and I believe in connecting with other human beings and the value, the intrinsic value that comes with connecting with other human beings. And music is an incredible way of connecting with other people.
Yeah.
I like Christmas carols. I don't believe in the story of Christ.
You love Christmas
I
carols?
love
Yeah,
Christmas
really?
carols,
Oh, gosh.
and I think there's a part of sort of shared cultural heritage that goes along with that. It's it's nice to think of Christmas time and singing with other people. I
Yeah.
think that's an incredible
Yeah.
part, of course. Is
It's really about
singing
belonging, being
Yeah,
a part of community.
exactly. And I
Yeah.
feel that especially now, when more than half of the population of the UK are not religious,
Yeah.
that sense of community, well, if it's done through music and the music references religious parts, I don't think that matters so much. As long as nobody's expecting me to believe in them.
Yeah. Because that's a different story.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think music can speak to audiences on the audience's terms without the audience having to buy everything that the music is saying. And of course, in the case of a number of composers where religious, semi-religious, or religiously inspired music was written, it was written not with the sense that the audiences would themselves be religious, but that it was inspired by. In the same way as there are lots and lots of music that have been written over centuries based on Greek or Roman mythology, without expecting people still to believe in the stories of Zeus and Poseidon.
Yeah.
And I think the same parallel exists today. Music should stand in its own right, and it doesn't matter where its inspiration comes from, as long as it still speaks to the audience.
That makes complete sense. Yeah. I guess since we're coming to an end, for those who are listening and watching and who are aspiring musicians, who want to pursue a career in, classical music and become world-known artists, what advice would you have for them?
Be inspired by everything around you. Remember that performance can mean many things in many different contexts. Work out, try as many things as possible, and then work out what you feel most comfortable doing. There are some performers who love being soloists. There are others who can't stand having a solo and would much rather be part of an ensemble.
Okay.
There are some that like performing in very formal contexts, like on stages for concerts.
Yeah.
There are others that like informal settings, and I think understanding what it is that you want to get out of being a performer, being a musician, really helps. Don't underplay the value of practice and dedication, whilst having an open and curious mind to everything that is going on around you. I think those things are those things will hold you in good stead.
Yeah. Then I will want to ask you, as a nice final, section of this podcast, do you have a quote that provided some kind of solace during creative hardship or even hardship in general that's related to your profession or just how you view life and just like your worldview in a way? Like, what is there a quote that you would revisit?
There is, as I think of it.
Oh, really?
I'm going to give you a little bit of the backstory first, and then I'll tell you what the quote is.
Perfect.
So it may well be an apocryphal tale, but I think King Solomon, who was someone who experienced what we would probably now describe as a sort of a bipolar, depressive, manic personality.
Yeah.
would experience these incredible lows and incredible highs.
Mm.
And so he went to his wise men of the day and said, create for me something that will get me through the worst moments and give me something to hold on to in those episodes of just unrealistic euphoria.
Yeah.
And one of them came back to him with a ring for him to wear, upon which was inscribed the words, "This too will pass." And I think as a quote, but also as a just a way of just thinking about and looking at life, creative processes, and art itself.
Yeah.
I think for me is quite helpful. Music is by its nature transient. I listen to it and I am present in it whilst it is playing, and then I will have the memory and the legacy of that piece. But the art itself has finished. It's not like a visual art piece that I can continue to look at over and over and over, unless it is actually playing. So in my mind, there is always this sense of, for me as an audience member, the music will pass. It will at some point stop.
Yeah.
Hardships will pass because things will move on. Great art, hopefully, lasts a very long time, but things gradually do drift in fashion and in vogue, and nothing will last forever.
Yeah.
And I think holding some sense of our place within that, I find very grounding. That I can make the most and the best of what I have in the moment, and I can do the best that I can do so that the legacy I leave behind is the best for others that it can possibly be, whether that's artistic or educational.
Yeah.
But that I will have a finite existence. My works will have a finite existence, and that's okay.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you for inviting me.